Again, my name is Patrick O'Halloran. I'm with WhereScape. I'm here with Kent Graziano. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to be talking about not just data governance, but what's beyond data governance in the age of AI. So I want to introduce WhereScape and then Kent, and then we will have probably about a 45 minute conversation about data governance, as I said, data governance and beyond in the age of AI. There is a Q&A button at the bottom. So if you do have questions, you can type in your questions. We'll try and answer them either as they come up, if it's appropriate, or at the end, if that makes more sense. So I want to take a couple minutes just to talk about who WhereScape is, what we do, who we are. WhereScape as a company has been around for 20 years. We started as a consulting company building data warehouses and realized there were a lot of repetitive tasks we were doing. So we started writing tools for automating a lot of those tasks, all the way from design to implementation, development, deployment, operations of the data warehouse. And those tools became incredible productivity multipliers to the point where we had customers that were asking us how we were getting so much work done so quickly. And we showed them the tools. They asked if they could buy them. And at that point, WhereScape stopped being a consulting company and began to be a software company. We've got about 1,200 customers around the world. We're not tied to any particular industry. We've got customers in government, education, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, finance, pretty much everything you can imagine. Pretty much anyone who's building a data warehouse. And I still use the term data warehouse, even though it's a little outdated. People talk about data lakes, data lake houses, data marts. We help accelerate the building of all of those. And that's that ROI at the bottom, the 8x developer output. We do that primarily through automation and templates, and I'll talk about automation in a minute. So sometimes you have to explain to people exactly what data warehouse automation is. People think they understand what it is, or they have a vague understanding of what it is. Basically, it's anything that you're doing in the development of your data warehouse that's pattern-based or repetitive. We can use WhereScape to automate that for you, to eliminate 95% of your hand coding, bundle up packages to promote from dev to QA to production, generate documentation, create jobs that are going to run, they're going to populate everything in the data warehouse. All those repetitive things we can handle automatically. And that certainly reduced costs. People think about labor cost, but there are a lot of other costs that are involved. Cost of rework. You'll find that with automation, because of the consistent style of development, rework, refactoring goes way, way, way down, becomes much, much, much easier. Risk is another factor why you should look at data warehouse automation. Gartner has a report out that says that of all the IT projects, data warehouses are the longest and riskiest projects with the highest failure rate. With warehouse automation, a lot of the possible mistakes you're going to make are eliminated, allowing you to do things in days or weeks instead of months or years, and gets things in front of the data analysts, gets the intelligence and information in front of the business owners, organizational leaders much, much faster. Complexity, we've had a lot of customers lately that are, because of mergers and acquisitions, need to integrate multiple data sources. Data warehouses used to be fairly simple in that you could pull data from a source or two, from a spreadsheet or two, and generate reports. But now you've got web APIs, you've got files that are showing up, you've got disparate systems, a sales system, a customer relation system, the complexity of not just the sources, but also the targets. Databricks coming out, Snowflake coming out in the last 10 years. Technologies are constantly changing and making things more complex. Data warehouse automation reduces a lot of that complexity. Urgency, we certainly saw during COVID, how companies' requirements can change on a dime. And lastly, agility. One of the things I really like about WhereScape is that you can work directly with the business. You can do collaboration where I can sit down with the data analyst, make prototypes right in front of them, and develop a data warehouse, a product that they're going to be using much sooner and really meets the needs of the business. So enough about WhereScape. You're not here to hear about WhereScape. You're here to listen to Kent and talk about data governance. And in case you don't know, Kent's done a couple webinars with us before. He's an award-winning author and speaker, well-respected as a thought leader in big data. We just changed this today to 40 years designing data warehouse and analytics solutions, Data Vault Master, and if that's not enough, an 8th degree black belt in Taekwondo. And also Ken has been working with WhereScape. I think you said since 2008, 2009 was the first time you saw it. And you said
2009.
You said you were looking for something that, well, do you want to just give a quick explanation of, we were mentioning Klebanov a second ago. You've had a story in the past about how you met him and how you got introduced to WhereScape.
Yeah. So at the time back there, I had been trying to apply agile principles to data warehousing since the early 2000s, and had developed a presentation and some papers and things on how to go about doing that in the data warehousing world, because I'd been doing data warehousing since the 90s. And so how to apply the agile principles. And I went to a local TDWI meetup in, I don't think they called them meetups at that point, they called them chapter meetings, in person in Denver. And our old friend Raphael was there doing a presentation, almost exactly the same presentation as I had been giving, about the principles of agile and agile methods and how to apply them to data warehousing, except that he in his talk had some screenshots of that kind of looked like there was some software that did some of these things and did the automation. And in talking to him afterwards, he did a real good job. He actually didn't even mention WhereScape during the presentation, other than he worked for WhereScape. And, I didn't know what WhereScape was at the time. So I talked to him afterwards and he said, yeah, there's software that does this. And then he proceeded to show me, WhereScape and tell me what it could do. And that's what got me started. I'd been interested in computer aided software engineering, CASE as we'd called it, in the early 90s, and had used some of the Oracle products to develop some fairly complex Oracle systems using Oracle's CASE tools, but had never seen anything that did it for data warehousing. And so WhereScape was the first one I had ever seen. And it really is, I'll say, it's really WhereScape's the grandfather of data warehouse automation. I mean, they pretty much invented the approach and the application. And that's what, got me involved with WhereScape back then. And, it's been kind of a, I'll say a casual on and off again partnership for 15 years.
Well, we're glad to have you here. And we are going to talk about data governance. And just to create kind of a baseline, we want to talk about exactly what data governance is. And again, our conversation is going to go a little bit beyond this. But Kent, do you want to walk through this definition and just talk about
we'll go through this definition.
Where data governance was and where it's headed?
Yeah, so this is from the Data Governance Institute. For those of you who didn't know, there was such a thing. There is a Data Governance Institute, and this is their definition of data governance. System of decision rights and accountabilities for information-related processes executed according to agreed upon models, which describe who can take what actions with what information and when and under what circumstances using what methods. There's a lot there. And people seem to most days kind of think that data governance is all about just having some good software. WhereScape's got some data governance features in its software package. It's like, yeah, if we got some good software, we can do data governance, right? But data governance really includes the standard thing: people, processes, and technology, right? So it's great to have a product that can help you apply your data governance rules, but as I said, is a system of decision rights and accountabilities for information related processes. Well, you have to have the process and you have to have the people. You've got to have the rules, like who gets access to what is what we're really talking about here. How do we secure the data? How do we make sure that we're only accessing data we have the right to access? That the individuals or organizations that we're providing this data to have the right to see that data and the right to use that data. In this day and age of GDPR and CCPA and other privacy regulations in the healthcare industry, there's HIPAA. There's a similar standard in education for protecting student information. We have to make sure that we know what those rules are. but we have to have a way of enforcing them. We have to have an organization that is thinking about this. It's not just thinking about, oh, hey, I've got 20 data sources. I'm just going to load all those 20 data sources into my Snowflake form, my Oracle database, whatever it is, and go nuts, data scientists. You grab all that data, use all that data, do something really cool with all that data. Really can't and shouldn't be doing that. And that's where data governance comes in relation to all of this, is really being able to describe these things and have rules written down, documented, agreed upon, in compliance with whatever regulations are required in your industry about who, what, and when, how people and organizations get access to specific pieces of data, all the way down to the column level. Like I said, technology is great, having things like, column level controls, column level masking, dynamic data masking, all of that, role-based access controls. All of this is part of executing data governance, but you do have to have, you got to know what the rules are, right? You don't want to be just randomly applying things, and you also don't want to miss, masking data that should be masked, loading data that shouldn't be loaded, even to that point. So that's kind of the background here on data governance. Has been around for a long time. You want to go to the next slide, Patrick?
Yeah, I thought ISO standards going back to 2005.
Yeah,
on data governance. And I guess the important takeaway here is that it's baked into the entire organization. It's not just something to slap on at the end.
It should be baked in, and that's where we get to this this thing here. This is a survey done in 2022, so just last year, by Deloitte, about data governance. And the piece on the left is very telling. What's your current approach to data governance? Only 19% of the organizations that they surveyed said we have a strong governance structure in place. 19%. And you got 48%, so almost half said, well, we're in process, but it's an ad hoc approach without a cohesive plan or operating structure. Okay, so they're just kind of like winging it. That means maybe you've got a couple of data architects, maybe a DBA, who kind of sort of know what the rules are. They might have the technology, so they know how to do dynamic data masking. They know how to do role-based access control, but it's pretty ad hoc. So that means, things could be slipping through the cracks. You could be giving people access to data that they really shouldn't have access to, just like accidentally, right? Because you made a role that has access to all of this data, and somebody else is assigning those roles to users without actually vetting the users. Classic one that I had years ago in the early 2000s, I was working for Denver Public Schools. And one of the challenges we ran up with was when somebody left the school system, in particular, somebody in the IT department, what was the process for deleting their rights? We had to document that. We were trying to get towards the one button decommission. Push a button and say, so Kent resigned. His last day is on January 20th. On January 20th, somebody should be able to push a button and go through and revoke my access to all of the systems. Right. So when we talk about people having ad hoc approaches, people were kind of doing that. It's like if somebody happened the DBA who had that control knew that this was my last day, maybe that DBA would go in and revoke my access. Maybe not. It might not get to it till a week after. But that was something, was very ad hoc. And so we had the process, but it wasn't solid, right? There was not clear communication. There wasn't something set up that said, okay, when someone leaves the organization, HR send a message to this list or to this person. Then we have 8% had no data governance program at all. So, okay, they admit it. We got no data governance. We're just using the data. And then the worst case scenario here, 25% of these organizations have no idea. Do we have data governance? Do we not have data governance? Don't know. So that's a very dangerous situation to be in. Over the last, probably 2-3 decades, my experience has been to see it's only like the largest organizations actually had solid data governance in place. So there's 19% having strong structure in place, and half of them thinking they might have something, that it's, but it's kind of ad hoc and we really haven't put it together. That means the organization hasn't invested in a data governance program, because it isn't just one DBA applying role-based access control, right? It's where I've seen it successful. There's a data governance committee and there's a team, right? And there's a lot of documentation that goes on to apply these standards. And this is, it's kind of scary as we're moving into this world of AI and the massive amounts of data with, as Patrick said, we've still got data warehouses, we've got data lakes, we've got data lake houses, and now we have data mesh, right? We have data mesh where independent domain teams within an organization are responsible for their set of data. Well, there still has to be an overarching data governance approach as to what is restricted, what is private, what should be secured, what doesn't need to be secured. And those rules have to be clear and available and taught to these individual domain teams. So there has to be some sort of a center of excellence to make sure that that happens. And it's helpful if there's processes and technology in place to help them do it, templates and things like that. So they're not on their own trying to figure out, well, how do I do role-based access control? How do I do dynamic data masking? How do I hide this data when it should be hidden? Now, on the right side here, this particular survey was around finance. So, what do you believe would be the greatest benefit to your organization when addressing finance data strategy? I think you can, pick any industry: healthcare data strategy, commercial data strategy, marketing data strategy, right? So 11% would say, okay, finance data governance. Okay, so the biggest benefit they think they're going to get is having some data governance on their data. 14% saying data cleanup and rationalization. Okay, well, in the data warehousing world, we call that scrubbing the data and integrating the data. 27% say data strategy models supporting processes and reporting needs. So they think that if they have some strong data governance in place, that's going to help with what they're trying to deliver on the analytics side. A single source of truth. Now, this one kind of surprises me. 28% think that the greatest benefit is they're going to get a single source of truth. Well, I think Patrick and I will attest that that's a pipe dream, right? The single source of truth has been the concept of data warehousing for 40 years. Trying to get that these days is very, very difficult. You need to know which data is legitimate, yes. Can you get it all into one?
Yeah, I appear to have lost you. Anyone else not getting Kent? Okay. Well, let me talk a little bit about this graph and this chart. My takeaway from this, and Kent had some very good points, was that people don't know what they want with data governance. The one on the left with the 25% don't know, the 19% strong governance. What that tells me is that there's more organizations that don't know if they have data governance that have strong data governance. Kent, you're back.
Yeah, not sure what happened there. It just disappeared. My Wi-Fi didn't drop or anything. Oh, well.
Okay.
Technology. So it automatically reconnected. So that's good.
Good. Yeah, looking at the graph on the right, I found some other stats about why companies and CEOs are looking at data governance programs. And 54% were efficiency in processes, which kind of like a single sort of truth data cleanup. But what's not listed on the right, 39% said regulatory, whether it's HIPAA or GDPR or whatever it is, Sarbanes-Oxley. There's a lot of legal requirements now for managing data and information that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that seems to be a big driver in data governance.
Yeah. And here to talk about, what is this like in the world of AI, right? And we talked about this in our webinar last month a little bit when we talked about data models. Is as we're getting into providing massive data sets to whether it's an LLM, a large language model, or a machine learning model of some sort, we need to know what we're feeding it, right? We need to be able to, this last part you just said, Patrick, about the regulatory, right? Are we using data to train the models that we're allowed to use, that we should be using, right? So that's just right up front. Who has access to this data? Are we saying that? And this is unfortunately the impression I get reading a lot of things today about the LLMs. Oh, okay, it has the entire internet as the source of data for things like ChatGPT. It's like, okay, but is everything that it's consuming really legitimate? Is it really legitimate data to begin with? But not only is it legitimate, is it, are these models finding data that should have been secured through a data governance program that weren't secured through a data governance program? And what kind of legal ramifications are there for that? That we've fed things into a model, we've fed basically private data into a model, right? And do we even know that we fed that data into the model? And if you don't know or have control over the data you're feeding into a model, then how are you going to ensure that the output of the model and what the AI ultimately tells you and is recommending in some cases or building in other cases, how do we know that that's legitimate, right? And it's really what we want. So maybe your next slide there, Patrick, on our other aspects of AI. So we've got in AI, there's a lot of things that go in. It's not just the data. And that's why we say this is beyond data governance. So this idea of data governance is one thing, what's going in, but you've got all these other aspects that we're talking about. The hypothesis is, what are we trying to do? What do we think we can do with this data, right? Good scientific method, you make a hypothesis and you test it, right? You test to see whether that's true or false. So, a candidate model that's going to do something, right? An algorithm, which is, your machine learning algorithm, that's code. Somebody writes that, maybe a team of data scientists maybe be writing that. The data sets that you're using in the AI training for learning, and then of course the output that's coming out of the AI engine. Each of these needs governance. The data sets, obviously that's data governance. Well, what about the algorithms themselves? How are we governing those? How are we making sure that the algorithms themselves are not biased and are not skewed? Right? It's not just a matter of, write a bunch of code and run it against this data and see what happens. So I think that's what a lot of people are doing, right? You see people, there's a lot of this concept of trial and error, right? Well, you've got to have a hypothesis, right? In order to know, what are you testing, right? When you're looking at the output, and how are we going to govern that? Are there metrics involved that we determine that, something has to be within certain bounds for us to use it? Otherwise, we're potentially, just like we do in the old days of software, are we moving stuff into production that's not actually been tested, right? Or it runs, right? The old Patrick, I'm sure you remember this. Oh, it compiles.
It compiles.
Right? So we talk about this with machine learning as well. It's like, okay, whether it's Python code or Scala or Java or whatever it is, okay, yeah, the program ran, and it ran through terabytes of data. And now we have this output. Well,
you talked last week, to give an example of this, about a AI system someone was building that was scanning resumes.
Oh yeah. And this is something I'm sure people have heard this particular story, and it seems like, what's a good one of these good uses for AI? Well, we've got some organizations, they're getting hundreds, if not thousands, of resumes in. Well, we don't have enough people in HR that are knowledgeable enough to go through and review all these resumes and figure out, out of this stack, who should we hire? So this one organization, they wrote a program, a machine learning algorithm that went through and examined the credentials of all the existing employees and categorized it, all of that sort of thing, different, whether it's a data analyst or a data architect or an HR manager, whatever it is. And they use that then to scan all the new incoming resumes, and it's kind of doing a match, right? It's looking for probably keywords and saying, okay, our current set of software developers, these are their skills, these are their characteristics. Well, let's look for the same thing in these resumes. Well, in the end, the result they got was not what they wanted. Is they actually had a very, very biased output where certain people were being ignored, and it was because the current set of data was skewed itself, right? Because the hiring practices in the past had been, fairly prejudiced and biased in a particular direction, and as a result, the AI was picking exactly the same kind of people when the organization had a diversity plan in place, and they wanted to hire a more diverse set of software developers than they had previously done. And this is a perfect example of, the data in was not going to get you the results you were looking for, because the original data set itself was biased, or skewed is probably a better way to say it, was skewed in a particular direction because of prior hiring practices. And so somewhere along the line, there has to be somebody looking at these sorts of things and looking at the hypothesis. The hypothesis is we can automate our selection of candidates by comparing existing employee characteristics to inbound resumes. Well, it turned out that hypothesis was the answer was yes, you can do that. But there was the next step of, well, what's our goal? Well, our goal is to have a more diverse workforce. The results did not match the goal in this case. So the hypothesis was wrong, right? Is in the end, they determined the hypothesis was wrong, is we can't automate the selection of candidates based on existing workforce characteristics and demographics. And so they had to come up with a different way to do that. And so that's where this governance comes in. And this is the type of thing that that folks don't think about, right? Is, we're just going to have the AI is going to do it, right? Well, okay, the AI is not infallible. The AI was programmed by humans. Right now, at some point, we're talking about all sorts of intelligent AI, that the AI is going to program the AI. And that's where I think it gets even a little scarier, right? The first layer has to be well governed in order to ensure that the next layer is going to get you what you want as well. So whether it's the hypothesis itself and doing some testing on the hypothesis to say, well, hey, this hypothesis, we did a little testing here, and yeah, it's not right. But in this case, they basically tested it in production, right? They built it, it ran, it got results. Nobody looked at the results to see if the results were in line with the goals, right? So the algorithm worked, the data set worked, the output was wrong, but it was wrong from a very different perspective. It was wrong from the goals. And that's where I say all this kind of governance thing has to come in. That it is beyond data governance now. Now we are talking about looking at the output, and does it align with our organizational goals? Does it align with the goals of the project, right? To build this AI. Why are we building the AI, right? And who's involved in designing this and determining what the overall goal of the output is?
Yeah, there was, I mentioned a data set where someone was trying to build an AI machine that could tell happy people from unhappy people, and they just fed it thousands and thousands and thousands of pictures. And what the AI model eventually learned to do was to differentiate between people who are outside versus people who are inside. Part of the difficulty of validating the output is you don't know what it's supposed to be. I mean, that's one reason you're feeding the AI machine, is to come up with new results. So what kinds of things can a business do or organization for these factors? Creating hypothesis, writing algorithms to teach the model, feeding it data sets, and checking the output. Are there structural things a company can do? You mentioned, I've been seeing a job title called data steward, as well as someone at the C level who's responsible for this sort of information. Is that necessary?
Yeah, these days, we have all kinds of weird titles out there. We've got data wranglers, right? We've got data stewards. We've got, I think the common standard name is the SME, right? The subject matter expert, which could be all over the place. So, we need people who understand the data itself, right? But we also have to have people that understand the business. So a business analyst, right? Someone who understands the goals of the organization, but also understands, the data space well enough to say, yeah, I don't think that's going to work. There are, Dan Lindstedt recently wrote something about poison data. It's like, so not only do we potentially have bad data or biased data, but we also have the potential of poison data where someone's actually feeding you deliberately a bad data set, or they're going in and skewing the data on purpose in order to wreck the result. So there has to be some level of testing, and this starts to overlap a little bit with data quality, right? Where's this data coming from? What's the metadata around that data? Have we validated that data set itself, that it's legitimate even? That's now a question we have to ask. Is it legitimate? Is it not poison data? There's bad data and then there's poison data. Poison data differentiation is bad data is stuff that, people have just done not a great job of input and making sure the data quality is there. Poison data is somebody's actually done something deliberate to make the data wrong in some aspect, with the intention of skewing the results of the AI to get a bad outcome. So yeah, data steward, I think it is a very high level. We used to talk about that a lot in data governance, and particularly even 20 years ago. It's like the data steward is the person responsible for understanding this data, at least from a business perspective, that, if there's a data quality issue, this is the person who has to look at it and say, yeah, that's not right. I don't know why that data is there. I worked with some folks when I worked at HP in the mid 2000s in supply chain, and the directors, they turned out to be really the subject matter expert data stewards. Is as we were building out a data mart for them, they were having to review the data coming out of SAP and saying, is this data right? And in many cases, it turned out the initial extract routines that had been written were incorrect. There was a problem in the extract routine, and they would take a look at the data we were getting to feed into the warehouse, go, this doesn't look right. I know we had more than this yesterday, right? This many things happen, and they go back into the SAP system and say, sure enough, here's all these transactions that aren't showing up in the feed of the data warehouse. And so they were the data stewards. They were the ones making sure that what we got was, in this case, a complete data set. It wasn't the data was wrong, it was just incomplete. As it turned out, there was a programmatic problem with the extract routine, where it was basically not getting all the transactions on any given day because of a buffer limit that it was. If we hadn't had them, then we would have been building a mart that was going to be used for some very tactical analysis that wouldn't have had all the data, which means the decisions that the executives would have been making would have probably been wrong. So we extrapolate that forward to today. If we're going to feed that into a machine learning algorithm, and ultimately an AI that's going to make, say, an inventory and purchasing decisions, which is what these guys were trying to do, it would have made the wrong decisions because the inbound data set was not complete.
And we've had a couple of questions asking about testing output. How do you test a system that's constantly relearning and changing what it's doing? Plus, how do you test something that's data-driven? by, possibly millions or billions of pieces of data. My initial thought is that you create the test plan when you create the hypothesis, and you have test plans throughout the entire 4 phases of an AI project. Do you have any comments about how do you test AI
Yeah, so this
output?
takes us back to that concept in Agile called test-driven development. And I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's like when you have the hypothesis, you need to come up with, what kind of answer are we expecting? How do we, like you said, how do we test this? Well, you got to be able to do it manually on a small scale, certainly. But somewhere along the line, you've got to come up with a way to say, what do we expect out of this output? And yes, when we get into this really sophisticated stuff, you don't know what the output is going to be. So how do you know that it's valid? Well, I'll say it has to pass what we call the smell test, right? Somebody who understands that space, a SME, a data steward, somebody has to look at that output as it's coming out while you're doing the development going, does this make sense first? Does this just on the surface of us, is this making sense based on what I know, what this or group of people, what they know about this data? That needs to be done very early on and needs to be done often. So this idea of automated regression testing, there's some statistical methods. This is where the data scientists come in, where they can test for skew and things like that. And it depends on the type of data that you're dealing with, and depends on the type of output as to how you're actually going to test that. But at minimum, it's got to pass the smell test, right? As somebody who is a subject matter expert needs to be able to look at that output and go, yes, that's reasonable. But that's again where this idea of governance comes in place. Somewhere there's got to be a checkbox that says, yes, this is approved to move to production. And again, we cannot rely on just saying, well, because it ran, therefore it's good, right? We don't want to do that because some of this stuff does have regulatory ramifications and compliance ramifications, and particularly in those if you're talking about finance and healthcare. I think it's incumbent upon the organization to put a governance structure in place to validate the results before anything is moved into production. Because in the case of healthcare, some of this stuff could be life and death, right? And so the idea of parallel testing, right, is like, somewhere along the line, we've got to have some way to simulate what we think what the AI is doing. Right? If it's so complicated that a human being can't figure it out, I have concerns myself personally on, well, should we be using that? If we don't know if the answer is right, if you're dealing with certain things like finance and healthcare, you're dealing with people's lives and people's money, should you really be using it? It may appear to improve the bottom line, and it's automation, it makes things faster, and you can be more competitive and all of that. But in the end, if it turns out that it's breaking some regulation, well, that's going to have a bigger cost in a different direction. That's not going to be as much fun for people.
When I think about AI and ChatGPT and things like that, I think of where Wikipedia was when it first came out. It was a nice thing, but no one relied on it as a source of truth. It was maybe it'll lead you towards some other sources you can look up. But over the last 10, 12 years, Wikipedia is kind of standing on its own now and is now cited directly instead of indirectly. For me, AI is kind of like that. The output from ChatGPT or something is a good starting point, but you definitely can't rely on it being 100% correct or 100% true. That may change in 5 or 10 years. One of my coworkers brought up a case. I looked it up this morning. There were a couple of lawyers who were suing an airline, and they used ChatGPT and fed it all sorts of information about case study or a case law and things like that. And ChatGPT spat out a brief that cited case laws that didn't exist, cited opinions that didn't exist. And the lawyers, not having checked any of that, sent it on to the judge. Well, the judge and the court checked it, found out that everything they cited did not exist, and they wound up getting fined a few $1,000s. But that's an example of just blind trust in something. The lawyer said something to the effect of, I didn't think ChatGPT could just make things up, but apparently it can.
Right, and somebody in the questions had actually brought up that idea of an AI hallucination, right? And that's where this governance part comes in. Is it is possible because, again, some of these are inference engines, right? In a lot of cases. So it read a bunch of things here and there and said, oh, well, if this is true and this is true, then this must be true. And that's the output, right? Well, that's the thing that we need to test. And in the case of what you're citing here is the lawyers took that output and assumed, and we all know what that means, assumed that the answer was right, where all they would have had to do is go into, I think it used to be called Westlaw. There are legal databases. If it's citing cases, you could have easily checked that by going into one of these legal databases and checking to see that that case law actually existed, that case actually happened. And I'm sure that every lawyer on the planet is now going to do that. It's like they may get the answer they can still get the answer faster by using something like ChatGPT and get their summation written up and all of that in there, but then they need to spend a little bit of time doing QA, right? Reads through it. It's like if it's citing certain cases and certain laws, that you at least go query the database manually yourself and say, okay, yes, that exists, that exists, that exists, that exists. You still save time, right? It's still faster than if they didn't know that case law existed, finding it themselves, or their paralegal finding it would have taken a lot more time. So they've still got some efficiencies here, but we can't assume that these answers are always correct because of things like this, as they call them, the AI hallucinations. So that does exist. And that is the challenge with all of this, with these self-learning algorithms and eventually potentially self-programming, is we've got to have that governance in place. And that again gets back to, it's not data governance in this case, it is governance. It's processes and procedures saying, if we're going to use the AI for these types of things, we must do these secondary checks before we put it out there, before we publish it, before we move that algorithm into production. And that's, organizations are going to have to do that. And again, depending on their industry and the topic and the type of data they're dealing with, these are all going to be, challenges, but we're looking for productivity. I mean, this is the ultimate in automation. Patrick, you talked about the value of automation early on. And, there's a lot of value in automating things, but, we got to make sure that we're automating the right things. And in the case of AI and LLMs, that we are getting valid answers out of them. Okay, so I think what's not here to do with Westlaw. Okay, good.
There's a question about, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm interested in your comments. Is data governance a holistic approach that requires the implementation of governance measures for diverse data domains? So how broad of a topic is data governance in terms of data privacy, data quality, master data management, data cataloging, metadata, data engineering, and data architecture? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah. I mean, it is data governance. It's an aspect of data management that often gets ignored. These disciplines have been around for decades with organizations like Data Warehouse Institute, DAMA, the Data Governance Institute, and the Data Quality Institute on data quality. But all of that, it's pretty all-encompassing, right? You've got to have the metadata, because some of the AIs are going to run off of metadata. A lot of code generators run off of metadata. Well, if the metadata is wrong, then what the generator puts out is going to be incorrect as well. So that's going to be our challenge going forward, is to, I think, fundamentally, we have to say we cannot and need to be unwilling to accept the output of a particularly new AI at face value, right? Without questioning. We should not be, unquestioning when it comes to these sorts of things. We need to, you need to read what it generated, right? ChatGPT has generated a lot of great things for people. This whole challenge now about for education is like, well, okay, if a student can just to ChatGPT and it basically writes the dissertation for them. Well, now we're checking, how do we know that that was AI generated versus the student wrote it themselves? Now there's an AI that in theory can tell if something was AI generated. A way of testing these papers. So we've gone way beyond plagiarism here. It's like it might not even be plagiarized, but it was generated, right? Not, through prompts. So the student knew enough to ask the questions, they knew the right questions to ask to get the result that they were looking for. But that doesn't mean they necessarily learn. But if they actually read the paper, they probably learn too. So there's a lot of controversy on that even right now. But again, so schools, education institutions are having to come up with, I'll call them governance rules onto what's allowed and what's not allowed. When can we use something like an LLM or ChatGPT, and when can't we? What's a good use of it? What's not a good use for it? And again, that's going to be determined based on the learning goals, because a class that's trying to teach people about LLMs and the limits of LLMs are likely to use them a lot to generate, to do their homework, right? A class on Greek moral philosophy that wants the students to learn the Socratic method and be able to articulate it and in verbally and written, well, they're not going to want them to be using ChatGPT to do something like that. And so the rules are going to be different even around the same technology, depending on what it's going to be used. And again, that's where it gets back to having some sort of a governance committee, having a governing body of some sort that says, what are these rules? What are the metrics? All of that's going to be important. And again, it is way beyond data governance. What we all know so far in this industry has really just been data governance. There's one of the other things that I wrote about a couple of years back with regard to AI and machine learning is ethics. Applying ethical standards. It's not just legal standards, but there's ethical standards that an organization may have based on the values of the organization. Do we want to ask this kind of question? Should we ask this kind of question? Should we build an AI that's going to do X, right? That's a question that people have to ask. It's, again, this is back into just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Very basic rule is, but people will do it. Without any framework or guidelines, you're likely to see people doing things that other people will say, well, man, they should have seen that coming, right? That's going to be hard. That's going to be hard. That's going to be a real challenge for people.
Ethics, I think, are going to be kind of done in two ways. One is there's just ethical decisions about what if AI is making decisions that impact people adversely. Who's responsible for that? And that's there's no clear answer for that right now. That's probably just going to evolve over time. But also, to some extent, I don't want to call it panic, but a general census among the population that AI can be a bad thing. We've all seen Skynet in the Terminator series and things like that. Do you see that as being a hindrance to AI in the future? Is people who are afraid of it, who don't understand it, putting up barriers?
Yeah, that's going to be hard. Yeah. I think that's going to be a challenge. That one's definitely going to be a challenge. There's lots of questions out there and probably not as many answers. I mean, you can go ask some of these questions to ChatGPT and see what it says.
I did ask ChatGPT once, how can I tell if an article has been written by ChatGPT? And it was pretty good. So I was using ChatGPT to identify other ChatGPT responses. And I do use it. I write emails and things and blog posts and stuff, but I generally, the one thing I've learned about it is it only responds well to good input. So you have to kind of know what to ask for and how to ask for it. And then what I get, I probably use 30% of it, and 70% of it, I'll still do my own research, get my own citations, put in my own quotes, my own stories, things like that. Yeah. But that's going to change going forward.
One of our questions here is thoughts on AI on data governance or data governance on AI, and I think we've kind of been talking around that quite a bit. Is ultimately, a certain amount of data governance can probably be done by an AI, right? If you've built the AI with the rules saying, okay, we're in healthcare, so we need to follow the HIPAA regulations. And if there's enough metadata, right, in the data sphere for the AI to harvest that metadata and say, hey, okay, we're looking at this data source. Here's all this data that should probably be masked based on HIPAA regulations, right? I think that's potentially doable, right? I think that is in the realm of possibility. You know, the data governance on AI is what we've been actually talking about, right? Is not just data governance, but governance on the AI. Is, are we building this as, say, general use AI? I've seen a lot now recently about people doing, basically LLMs within their organization. And a lot of talk about that with the Snowflake Summit last month, with some of the new capabilities Snowflake has and some of the partnerships they've done, is to, using your internal data to build an AI to do things internally in your organization, not necessarily public facing. So I think data governance, generating your data governance rules inside of your organization, according to your organizational rules or according to your compliance rules, I think that's potentially doable. I can see that as something becoming available, but again, it all is dependent on the metadata that's available, right, and the quality of the data source. I had a question just yesterday from a former colleague at Snowflake about, can an AI, if I have a number of data sources, can I point an AI at it and have it generate a dimensional model for me? And my answer was, it depends. Another former colleague at Snowflake recently used ChatGPT to generate a data vault model, and it was actually pretty good. It was against the TPCH data set that was in the free one that comes in your Snowflake account. And it came up with actually, it followed the data vault rules, was able to find the data vault rules. He had to ask some smart questions and say, hey, use SHA-256 for the hash to generate the primary keys. And it actually generated all the insert code and the build code, and it was all actually correct. But he had to know what right questions to ask because he knew data vault. He's a data vault expert. So the same thing I think goes for things like dimensional models. But my answer really was, it depends. Is like, if your data source is just a bunch of flat files with nonsensical column names and file names, the odds of a AI being able to generate a valid dimensional model are pretty slim. Because if a human being can't look at it and decode it and say, this file and this file are related, and I know that because they both have the column customer ID in them, right? There's got to be some clue there somewhere. Eventually, an AI that could go and scan all the data, the best it's going to be able to do is say, okay, there's some overlapping domains here. There's 20 columns here, and there's 40 columns here, and 10 of those columns look like the data is in the same domain. They're all integers, they're all between 0 and 550 million, or they're all dates, whatever it is. It can see some similarities, whether it's data type or ranges and things like that. And it can maybe suggest, well, hey, these might be related. But would you want to rely on that then to build out a dimensional model? Again, if there's not enough metadata there, I don't think it can do it yet. Today, it would have to be able to, do a very deep analysis on all the data itself to say that these different data sets, say out in your data lake, are actually related, and come to the conclusion of, okay, all of this data should go into a customer dimension, right? So again, back to the data governance and the idea of testing your hypothesis is, you need to know something about the data. It's like, do you have even a guess? Should this dimensional model have 5 dimensions, or should it have 500 dimensions? Right. And so you've got to be able to, again, do that smell test and say, is there enough information there for the AI to actually come up with the right conclusion? Or is there too much data and you're going to get, this AI hallucination where it's going to propose a model that is completely nonsensical, that, it's got 5,000 dimensions and 2 facts. And everybody looks at it, it's like, okay, that can't be right.
Yeah, we get kind of the same question at WhereScape because of the data automation we do. Is that going to eliminate my job? I guess the similar question is, AI going to eliminate my job? And the answer is no. because there's still things that require, like you said, someone to look at disparate things to recognize patterns that right now AI just really can't do. So while you can get great productivity with WhereScape in creating dimensional models, data vaults, and things like that, just like you could with ChatGPT, it's not going to, it gets rid of the redundant pattern-based tasks, not the actual intelligence and analysis
Right.
part of it. Yeah, we're coming close to the top of the hour. I just want to bring up one last slide. And thank you, Kent, for all the information. We're not going to get to all the answers to all the questions, but I'll respond back to the non-anonymous ones, and you'll get a follow-up email from us later today or tomorrow about this. If you have any questions, feel free to respond to that. I didn't have a chance to show off WhereScape very much, but that's because I was listening to Kent too intensely. So thank you for that. But if you do want more information about WhereScape, about data warehouse automation, how you can literally, like I said, get things done in days or weeks instead of months or years in building a data warehouse, how you can implement data governance standards in a consistent way. One of the things we didn't talk about is one of the big advantages of automation, data warehouse automation, is all the objects are all created in similar ways, very consistent, much easier to test. I gave the example yesterday to Kent of one of our customers. Since everything's template based, the QE team tested the templates, and they said, okay, if this template exists and we've QA'd it, we don't need to do unit testing on any objects created by that. So they were getting huge efficiencies out of that as well. If you want more info at wherescape.com. If you want to talk to us one-on-one, you can go to wherescape.com, request a demo. We'll be glad to talk with you, find out your specific requirements, and really show off our design tool and our implementation tool. So Kent, any last words of wisdom?
Be careful out there.
Do good things.
We don't want Skynet.
Yeah. All right. Hey, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. And thank you all for attending. And you'll be getting an email with a link to this recording if you want to watch it again or share it. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.